Okay, thank you. It's so good to see so many interested people here today to learn more about classical liberalism and where liberalism is heading in the future. So warmly welcome here to Timbro in Stockholm. We are also sending this seminar on YouTube, so it can be seen immediately or afterwards if you want that. That also means that we will use mics, and later on when we have questions from the audience, there will be mics distributed so that everyone can hear what you are saying. My name is Björn Hasselgren. I'm a senior fellow here at Timbro, working with questions related to liberalism, as we do here at Timbro. Otherwise working with strange things like infrastructure and how roads and railroads work and function now and in earlier times. We will have this seminar in English, as we have also said in the invitation. And we will spend the time thinking about what is liberalism. And thinking about that, you can always go to the web, and I went to Wikipedia to check out what they say what classical liberalism is. And I will read that, so then we know that. So, follow me here. Classical liberalism is a political ideology and a branch of liberalism which advocates civil liberties and political freedom with representative democracy. It's under the rule of law and emphasizes economic freedoms found in economic liberalism, which is also called free market capitalism. So now you know what classical liberalism is. Let's see if we have another view following the presentations and discussions today. We will start out with a presentation, a lecture, more or less, from Professor Daniel Klein. He's a professor at the MacArthur Center, George Mason University in the USA. He's also working for Ratio Institute here in Stockholm. And he's a friend of Timbro, and we have reading groups and summer seminars, often discussing Adam Smith and classical liberalism. And Adam Smith is one of your major themes also working in the academia. We have three discussants. Let's see. Carl Rudbeck, well-known debater and writer in literature and liberalism and economic and ideologic questions since long. You wrote a PhD already in 1976, I have learned. Yeah. Around Walter Benjamin. That's interesting. We have Karin Svanborg-Sjövall, the CEO and Timbro. Perhaps everyone knows Karin. You are well known in the debate around liberal questions, perhaps the primary liberal debater in Sweden right now, discussing future of liberalism and what we call here in Sweden the bourgeois political strand. We also are very proud to have Jesper Alin here, who is a doctoral student at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, where he's working on a PhD thesis right now around the concept of autonomy, conceptual and normative analysis. And the mix of moral philosophy, political philosophy is an interest of Jesper. We will do this like in the following way. Dan starts out with his lecture, something like 40 minutes. There are handouts with the slides. Dan is interested that you follow the slides to understand and follow the things. And then I will ask up the panel, and they will have some introductory comments, and then we will have a discussion among the panelists and also invite Dan to be part of that. Dan, of course, will comment. And then we will open for questions from the audience. And as you have already seen, we have a special Friday afternoon mingle style on this, and there are also books available from Timbro to buy, as many of you have done already. And we, of course, welcome you to stay on here and have more discussions on classical liberalism and the future of liberalism. So having said that, please, Dan. Can we give Dan a hand to start with? The floor is yours.
Right. Well, it's a thrill and an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here. That description of classical liberalism I was quite fine with. However, it did begin, classical liberalism is a branch of liberalism, blah, blah, blah. And I'm here to tell you that classical liberalism is the trunk of liberalism, okay? Now, I've got to work two cursors at the same time, so bear with me if they get a little disjointed. Yeah, when we talk about classical liberalism, people sometimes think, oh, you're just making it up. But no, I think it's cogent, and that there is this civilizational arc, or if you like, trunk, that culminates in liberalism 1.0, as we're calling it here, and that Adam Smith looms large in that. I think our genes and instincts are rooted in the ancestral band. Our brains were selected for a small, simple society with strong social cohesion, and as a result, we have strong tendencies towards what I'm calling cohesionism in politics, tendencies that don't fit modern life, and that I think we need to rechannel and subdue. Jumping forward, traditional society was, if you think back in these days, where people tried to achieve a shared vision of the good, a shared purpose, a shared way of life, unification of church and state, and we feel that sharing should encompass our society. Traditional societies inculcate shared understandings of the sacred things in life, producing conformity and uniformity in the higher things, as I'm calling it, the sacred things, the most meaningful things in life. And then the lower things in life, the more mundane things, are understood to serve the higher things. So again, we see this impetus towards cohesionism. The printing press came in 1440, and intellectuals were able to innovate. People seceded, in a sense, from Roman Catholicism. But there was still a sense that the ruler's religion would be the law, and there would still be that traditional society. And so, in a sense, people fought over the ring of power, and people butchered each other in religious wars for a long time. It was quite dreadful, as I'm sure you know. Oh, I got to do this one too, I'm so sorry. And this gave rise to the idea of religious toleration, and then religious liberty. The separation of church and state, even a kind of free market in churches, and then the idea of liberty, period, the free market. Meanwhile, this is the time of the rise of the nation state. This passage from Arthur Melzer nicely captures some of this. Early modern thinkers endeavored to find a form of politics that could do without such consensus. They deliberately set out to subvert traditional society and to replace it with a fundamentally new kind of social organization, one that would renounce the ever precarious attempt to define the truth about life's highest goods. Instead, it would unite men on the promise of preventing the most obvious and basic evils. Thus, by standing traditional society on its head, by openly switching the purpose and moral basis of the state from our highest to our lowest end, they attempted to separate politics from the whole disputed sphere of morality and religion. So this movement was to focus now on the lower things and to try to get the state working on the lower things and backing off the higher things. To do that, they needed to clarify what these lower things are, the pieces, the components, by dividing and subdividing rights and spelling them out in jurisprudence. This creates a kind of basic operating system, if you will, which later emerged in Adam Smith's words as the liberal plan. I think these guys were quite aware of the dangers of discohesion that come from this momentous switch, this trunk of liberalism. But they had a faith in spontaneous order that by letting people pursue the lower things, they would nicely find their ways to the higher things. The liberal plan does monkey with the high thing space to some extent. It closes off part of that space. It frowns on the more cohesionist, or if you like, statist answers to the highest things. It seeks to condemn and preclude that. But then it otherwise kind of leaves the high space things open, okay? It does not forsake the high space things, virtue, right, larger justice, goodness. It just has a different approach to it, and it thinks that the liberal approach is better than the alternatives, essentially. I don't think of it as any kind of formula or maximand. It's more sensibility about focal alternatives and what's desirable. So see, these are some of the guys that I'm talking about. These are some guys that I like and that I think are central in it. Back off of the higher things, they're sort of telling government. Incidentally, the theme that Christianity made liberalism possible resonates with me, and perhaps it did so, by creating a kind of humankind encompassing ethical backdrop that mitigates the discohesion problem of liberalism. In other words, liberalism works better among Christians, perhaps. So these guys were highly Christian, or at least professed to be so, and wrote for Christianized audiences. Grotius focused on the lowered things, and this amounted to making jurisprudence central in moral and political philosophy. He spoke of, in Latin, suum, one's own. So what is this one's own, and how is it secured? That was sort of the focus. They taught that focal rules emerge for this, that only outward action is justiciable, and that government's main job was to safeguard this suum, one's own. I'm sorry, I didn't show you this slide. Isn't that terrible? Yeah. Let's see what, okay. Yeah, I'm falling behind. Sorry about that. One more. Smith and others tell, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused myself now. I did this. Yeah, I'm sorry. Tell this story about the movement through feudalism towards the modern state, where a governor or superior, a sort of jural superior, governs the citizens who are inferiors, and the hope is to nurture a liberal approach to policy and politics in all this. Meanwhile, this emphasis on the lower things, the jurisprudence, highlights the very special nature of government in that it is this special player that does things which, if other people tried that, if your neighbor tried that, it would be regarded as criminal. The jurisprudential element is distinctive. So liberalism, is distinctively modern. Liberalism 1.0 is modern in the broad scale of things, the last several centuries. So the term classical liberalism is rather awkward, actually, because classical liberalism is modern in the sense of post-Machiavelli. It's not the classics, like in the classics department. Now, these guys wrote in a world without political stability, and they strove for political stability. And in doing so, they tell stories about movement from state of nature to political society in terms of social contract or political consent. And I propose that we see that as a myth-making ploy suitable to the situation of lack of stable polity. Contract around society was venerable and solemn, and they invoked the prestige of contract really for two sorts of reasons to cope with the issue of political stability. One was to tell citizens that they have bound themselves by contract to go along with the government, so they need to put up with this in the hopes of achieving a more stable polity. The other way it was used was to contend that a bad government had in fact violated the contract. This would be the Glorious Revolution or the American War for Independence, and to justify the ousting of a bad regime and the installing of a new one. But shortly after the Glorious Revolution, Britain attained robust political stability, and our next heroes, Hume and Smith, lived in and wrote for such a world, presupposing a stable polity. That is, I think, one reason why we find it easier to understand Hume and Smith than we do the 17th century writers. But still, there is strong continuity from them to Hume and Smith, as Stephen Buckle, I think, shows, for example, in this book here. So we have a kind of tradition in this jurisprudence, Grotius, Locke, Hume, and so on. We have political stability in Britain coming in Hume's time, or just before. Hume and Smith are clearly very cohesive. They're buddies and very close in thinking. And then Smith gives liberal this political meaning. It's in Smith's time, and in particularly with The Wealth of Nations, where liberal takes on this new political meaning. That is this liberalism 1.0 I'm referring to. So in this manner, we extend liberal backward in time before that word functioned as a name for this political outlook, before 1776. But because this tradition, this trunk, if you like, opening up to liberalism 1.0 in Hume and Smith, is so cohesive. It's such a flow. I mean, I think there's so much of a continuity from Grotius and so on. I think it's totally appropriate to extend it backward in this fashion. Perhaps, if you like, calling, oh gosh, what happened here? Oh my goodness. Proto-liberals, calling these guys proto-liberals. Okay, so in this stepwise fashion, we extend it backwards. So David Hume, he was quite brilliant in understanding issues of mutual coordination and focal points, the way Thomas Schelling did in recent times, and seeing things as focal points. In fact, seeing things sort of as focal points all the way down. And he spoke of such things as language as convention, like David K. Lewis did. Now, for him, convention does not imply consent or contract. It's a broader concept. And so for him, political authority, which those guys were trying to explain in terms of social contract or consent, is rather for Hume here. It's not consent. It's a convention. And so he looks at political, in this world of stable polity now, he looks at political authority that way, which I think is a much healthier way, and Smith follows him in this manner. He said that there are certain conventions which are natural in the sense that they are necessary for society to get on and survive, and in that sense, they're universal. He attacked social contract and instead, as I said, interpreted political authority in terms of convention. And he did likewise for justice or commutative justice, the specific narrower form of justice we're interested in. Moving along. Smith elaborates justice or commutative justice as one of the virtues you are to practice. He says that you do so by obeying these most sacred laws of not messing with your neighbor's person or liberty, not messing with his property or possessions, not messing with the rights due to him from others, that is to say, promises or contracts due to him. And this he called commutative justice. I think a good way to formulate it is not messing with other people's stuff. And here, this is the general formulation for this concept, which is the central concept in this whole tradition I'm referring to from Grotius and so on. It's general, and again, it's got to be maintained, but in historical context, it does vary. Fine points of what counts as stuff, what can be property, depends on historical circumstance. what makes it one guy's rather than another guy's? Whose stuff is it? That varies with history some. And what constitutes messing with it? Gosh, I'm sorry about this. These things all vary with historical context. And so what we have is a sort of uniformity amidst variety in this whole formulation of justice. Government affects some of the fine points, but it doesn't undo the natural conventions, and Smith is ready to say, no, the government's violating justice here. So this justice is not determined by the government, not fully determined by the government. This thing here is my hand as a natural convention. And if the government says it's not, if we live in a slave society, Smith says, no, that's beyond the fine points issue. That's a violation of natural justice or commutative justice. And so there is justice beyond legal positivism. Commutative justice plays very special roles in TMS. One of them is the distinguishing between this equal relationship in society, like you and me, you and your neighbor, you and Novak Djokovic. Now, he's your superior in tennis, but in jural matters, governing matters, Novak Djokovic is just another jural equal to you, okay? Private sector, if you like, equals. From the superior-inferior relationship, that is, oh gosh, that is the governor and the governed. And so that's a fundamental distinction that he runs with. He doesn't try to reduce one to the other the way the social contract theorists did. This commutative justice is very special among the virtues, and he highlights their specialness. Their rules are precise and accurate, whereas all the other virtues have rules that are loose, vague, and indeterminate. The actions that it treats are generally ones we are not to do. Doing nothing or passiveness is usually sufficient to satisfy commutative justice. You know, if you sit still and do nothing, you manage not to mess with other people's stuff. Feedback on one's performance is only negative, whereas for all other virtues, it's positive and negative. In equal relationships, an observance of the rules is indispensable, otherwise society degenerates. That's that natural convention element. We feel a stricter obligation to observe it. Indeed, it may be forced. And the formulation of commutative justice, not messing with other people's stuff, has a flip side, others not messing with your stuff. So this jurisprudence concept of justice has a flip side that's highly political and now is applied to the jural superior. Don't mess with our stuff. It's not an ironclad rule, it's not an axiom, but it's a presumption. And in the superior-inferior relationship, that's called liberty, okay? The flip side relationship is reflected in this passage that I had there. Now, this is a way of seeing that Smith is showing the very great specialness of this and laying out its specialness among the virtues, commutative justice. But that is not to say that he sees all of life as commutative justice. He's got other forms of justice which he also affirms, distributive justice, estimative justice. And you can think of these as in a way corresponding to the words from the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, the lower things, letting people, by spontaneous, voluntary, competitive processes, pursue the higher things. I think this is the whole arc. So in Wealth of Nations, I'd say the spine of liberalism shows up as this commutative justice, liberty concept. It affirms this presumption of liberty. The presumption is on the contravenor, just like the presumption of innocence puts the burden on the prosecution. And the book morally authorizes the pursuit of honest income and this presumption of liberty. And bang, what happens? We get a vast increase in wealth and well-being. and he establishes liberal as a political term. It hadn't been a political term really before that, and that later matures as liberalism. Now, in other lectures, I've talked about this semantic history, so I can't go into it here in any detail, but it does blossom. People immediately pick up on Smith, and terms like liberal principles, liberal policy, liberal system, liberal plan, liberal government get used. Liberalism comes alive as a political persuasion and outlook. There are different ways you can show this. Anyhow, he speaks of the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. That's associated with allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way. I'm so sorry about this. And each doing so by his own accord, a kind of idiom that's pervasive. I want to say that this is an ascendancy. It's not as though the 17th, 18th, most of the 19th century, if we talk about that as the liberal era, I'm not suggesting that that was comprehensive liberalism fully achieved, whatever that would mean. It's a period of ascendancy. It's a period of this arc, this tree trunk, gaining ground, persuading people, the intellectuals, the top intellectuals, at least in the British context, being along these lines. So it's an ascendancy. Smith spoke about the ideas being plain and intelligible to common understanding. Does that mean we have a simple formula, an axiom? No, we don't. There's a lot of complications, and in treating those, I think there are many valuable distinctions that we need to try to keep track of and understand. I just want to put these up here to show you that I'm not trying to make it sound real simple. And I think that maybe some later day liberal types have gone too far in trying to make it simple. There's a distinction between the equal-equal jural relation and the superior and inferior. There's the stable polity versus not. There's what Smith calls the science of a legislator versus the art of liberal politics. You could make other distinctions with respect to liberty that are shown here. In terms of the discourse, jumping to number 10, coming from people like Smith, I think we need to understand it in terms of what they're doing as bargaining or versus challenging and the different roles they're playing in the culture. Political feasibility is an important thing to keep in mind in terms of what they're saying and why. And exoteric versus esoteric writing, if you're familiar with that. So there's a lot of distinctions and complications, but I think it survives all of this. They're worth working through, but I still think it survives, and we come to a big tent liberalism with a general posture against the governmentalization of social affairs. It's directional. It's from the status quo. It's leaning this way, maybe more or less anxiously or avidly, but it's a directional thing. It's not about a destination and an ideal system. Incidentally, I do think the British experience is special and central in all this, and that we should come to grips with that. That's not to say that other countries don't have their great liberal traditions, including Sweden itself. I think Sweden is extremely special and remarkable in these ways as well. Anyhow, back to sort of a narrative. After 1880, liberalism quite suddenly declined. Many say because it failed. I think other explanations make sense, but I can't go into that here. Anyway, the mentality of governmentalization really surged. I mean, there's a dramatic psychological, political change at the end of the 19th century, and it moves steadily through the 20th century. Maybe I shouldn't say steadily, but hugely, dramatically. And we get a vast growth in the governmentalization of social affairs. And most importantly, perhaps, the central words of liberalism lost or changed meaning, including the word liberal itself. At this website, Ryan Daza and I created compendia of quotations showing the semantic changes and reactions to these semantic changes. Very dramatic period. One picture that captures it perhaps better than any other is that, the now's more social democratic collectivists who were now calling themselves liberal started to call themselves new liberal. And so the engram shows right around 1880 the growth of the term new liberal, which then prompted others to resort to saying old liberal, which you also see in the thing. You can think of three faces of liberalism. Liberalism 1.0, with the presumption of liberty. Democratism, which is to say the expansion of the vote, the expansion of political participation, and the governmentalization of social affairs. If you like, the modern North American version of liberal. Now, they'll suggest that leftism, if you will, is not contrary to liberalism 1.0. It's true to the original values of it. It's just that conditions have changed and new conditions call for different policies to serve those enduring values. And so they see this kind of compatibility. I don't buy that. I see more of a tension between leftism and liberalism 1.0. I think leftism indulges this cohesionism within us from the ancestral band. And Hayek argued this in his atavism thesis about modern politics. He argued that modern politics of the democratic nation state have clicked into a powerful but misguided cohesionist penchant and promotes the governmentalization of social affairs. In this manner, we may see the left as actually kind of reactionary in a very broad sense to the discohesion of the liberal polity and is looking to restore social cohesion through governmentalization. There's a whole lot about these two where I think the fundamental tension is seen. There's the presumption of liberty in Smith versus, it seems to me in the left, almost an opposite presumption very often. There's opposition to governmentalization versus a more of a relish for it. There's small government versus big government. There's simple rules versus complicated, voluminous rules, which result in bureaucracy. There's keeping government out of the higher things versus having government tend and lead the higher things. There's not policing inner thoughts versus punishing bad thoughts, hate crimes, bad speech, discrimination. There's the subdividing of ownership versus a kind of people's collective ownership or people's overlordism, which I think helps sort out how the leftists see things. They kind of see Sweden, if you will, as kind of like a collective property, like the substructure of the country is collectively owned by all the Swedes. All the stuff that's happening on top of this is sort of by allowance of being at the people's home, if that term rings a bell. And so all of that is actually voluntary, because it's like you check into the people's home and you have to abide by the people's rules. So they don't see it in the same subdivided way that I'd say the liberal 1.0 do. They see it as actually enmeshed in social contract based on being in Sweden. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. And on that basis, they see government as voluntary, whereas Smith and those guys understood that the jural superior was not voluntary. Other things, I think there's a whole bunch of other things that I see as tensions. Hume and Smith, although they affirm the holiness of the whole, it's very indeterminate. It's very open-ended, whereas I think leftism tends towards a more immanent whole, looking for a more definite whole and good of the whole. Hume and Smith give no final validator of the higher things. They don't specify how the higher things are validated, whereas again, I think the left looks for a final validator. Hume and Smith are extremely rich on knowledge and the disjointedness of knowledge. I think the left tends to presuppose or yearn for a kind of common knowledge. Hume and Smith offer a number of open society sympathies from which we are to find meaning in life. It's kind of up to you. And I think the left looks for an encompassing sympathy or romance too often. Hume and Smith very much see society as a spontaneous order. The left tends to see it as organizational. Hume and Smith do not see literal cooperation throughout the polity, but the left looks for a sense of literal, vast cooperation throughout the polity. Hume and Smith emphasize this commutative justice. The left talks about something called social justice. In a way, I think the left can be thought of as a faction in Madisonian terms, even if it's a majority. In a way, I see the recent Republican victory in the United States somewhat in these terms. That is, an array of non-left factions, even differing greatly from one another, voted Republican in opposition to the left faction. Liberalism around the world often means liberalism 1.0. In fact, I'd say that's largely true here in Sweden. You know, it's a huge difference in language between here and North America. And communications technology kind of makes us more global. We can communicate more with people around the world, and they more often speak English nowadays. But I also want to ask you to think about technology pointing another direction. I think we naturally seek moral authority, and now we can commune better with personalities of the past. Think of this communication technology not only helping us talk to people on the other side of the globe, but also from 200 years ago. And that's because their texts are available. We can search them, we can discuss them, we can listen to podcasts about them. They're freely available and so on. And in this way, these figures grow less distant, even though years pass. So in conclusion, I think liberalism 1.0 is the spine of the modern open society. It leans against governmentalization, upholds the presumption of liberty. Its paramount figure, in my view, is Adam Smith. It recognizes complications and compromises, and it's, I feel, basically at odds with leftism. This shot is from the end of Roman Holiday. It is to remind us that the higher things are your responsibility. Liberalism does not supply them. Liberalism is only a political persuasion. It is not a philosophy of life. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. There are so many ideas and thoughts in your presentation. You could remain. We could have just some few questions.
Sure, certainly.
Please stay. I had some questions, and we will have more of them. Listening to you, I was thinking about Hayek. Is always good to read Individualism and Economic Order, and he's in a famous text by him, Individualism, True and False. He's discussing many of these things, and if you read Hayek, he says that there can be little doubt that Adam Smith's chief concern was not so much with what man might occasionally achieve when he was at his best, but that he should have as little opportunity as possible to do harm when he was at his worst. So they were looking for a system that would function well and make use of men in all their given variety and complexity, sometimes good and sometimes bad, sometimes intelligent and often more stupid. Perhaps this gives a good picture of what kind of situation, what kind of society Adam Smith was thinking about and Hayek has been thinking about. I think when you discuss and present these things, one of the things that you have to think about is this concept of commutative justice, which is really central to these ideas, and perhaps we should come back to that a bit here. Why is this idea of commutative justice, the equal relationship, so central in Adam Smith's ideas and in liberal ideas? Why?
I'd say that he really wants to understand society in terms of ownership, and in terms of tangible things about life that are the focal points for us to muddle through and to interact with each other, especially to interact with people we don't know very well in a growing, complex world. And so we need to understand what are the proper relationships to those physical things. It could be a computer, it could be your person, and so on, and what duties bear on you to respect that ownership in others. And by focusing on ownership this way, you can build out this whole philosophy of one's own ownership, one's own suum, and then the flip side of, okay, so there's a reciprocal principle here of others not messing with my stuff. I mean, it sounds horrible. Oh, don't mess with my stuff, whatever you do, all I care about, don't mess with my stuff.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, we all like that, but
we are doing it right now.
It's very,
we are not messing with each other.
It's very easily tarred as selfish and so on and so on, which is exactly what the left does, I feel, and unfairly, for the most part. But it is the grammar, and it uses the grammar analogy very centrally. It is the grammar of social life. And respecting that grammar is terribly important to keeping liberal society functioning smoothly, despite the discohesionist tendencies of a free society. If we continue to respect other people's stuff and other people's dignity, that's real important for letting liberalism happen. But then it also applies to the government. I mean, it should also apply to presumptively. He's not an anarchist or anything like that, but he's serious about the presumptive status in the jural superior relationship as well. For all sorts of reasons, partly because it works in a whole lot of humane ways. He's not unconsequentialist by any means.
And I think Adam Smith is clear on that, and Hayek is especially clear that liberalism and social events, it's a process. It's a process of things, process of equal relationships and other relationships. And that is very important to understand. It set a system for how a free society could work in process, everyday process, also with men being stupid sometimes, not always at their best. Okay, Carl. Comments?
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. Well, I really nothing to add. Because Dan said was pretty definite about Adam Smith, but maybe still, I think you have a rather narrow definition of liberalism as a purely economic ideology. You emphasize this justice thing, what's mine is mine. Excuse my crude language, but at the gym the other day, there was a big guy there, brawny guy, and tattooed over his chest was "fuck off or die." It sounded like he sort of somehow illustrates this central thesis of your view of liberalism, but I doubt he was very liberal. But now to elevate the discourse a little bit, I think that you can be liberal and still take issue with this very narrow definition of liberalism. I remember Amartya Sen wrote a book about justice. I don't have the title, it's not Theory of Justice. But he has a rather touching little example about a flute. There are three girls, there is one flute, but there are three girls who all want the flute. One girl made it, fabricated it, made it out of a piece of wood. One girl could really play the flute well, and one girl had nothing and she wanted the flute. It's a cute little example, but I think it's a real problem there. But then you don't seem to think there would be a problem. According to your core liberalism, the girl who made the flute has absolute power over the flute. And by the same token, I think you would hardly count, let's say, John Rawls as a liberal.
John Rawls?
Yeah.
Not liberalism 1.0.
No.
Not really.
But let me take a step back. You talk about the trunk of liberalism. Let me try to talk a little bit what I think are the roots of liberalism, which is not so much a core economic view. It's rather an attitude towards life, towards existence. And there, I think, one of the towering figures in European thought and in liberalism would be Michel de Montaigne. His essays, his core question is, what do I know, que sais-je? Is exactly, I think, the question all liberals should ask all the time. And your touch on that towards the end, that there is, for example, no final validator, which I think is an extremely important liberal tenet, liberal core value. And there I think you find that in Montaigne much more than in your pantheon. So I would say there is another strand towards liberalism, which in a sense is not as stringent, not as intellectually coherent as yours, but has still a lot going for itself, because that makes liberalism not so much something you can look up in the book, something you can find in the Wikipedia, but rather an attitude which pervades your whole life. And I think also we can emphasize Christianity's role in building liberalism. Also, you flashed very quickly the cover of Larry Seidentop's book, The Invention of Individual, which I think is a very important, unduly neglected book. And Seidentop would say that liberalism emerges much earlier than Smith or even Montaigne. He sees it as the title indicates, as the invention of the individual in the scholastics in the Middle Ages, who started to talk about justice in an individual sense. And here we have one core root of liberalism, which I think also, and now we're getting into a little bit of a minefield, is liberalism even conceivable outside of a Christian society? I know that when Giscard d'Estaing wanted to include something that Europe is a Christian continent in the preamble to EU constitutions, don't hold me to the letters there, he met a great opposition. But if you read Seidentop's book, you can see that liberalism, democracy, individualism are very, very intimately connected. And I think here liberalism goes a little bit beyond also the economic narrow focus you choose to emphasize. But I'm here to be a little bit of a devil's advocate. I think at the very beginning of your speech, you said something which I found extremely intriguing. You talked about the early band cohesion. Do you think that means that liberalism can only work on a rather limited scale? And that means, of course, that the EU would be a great anti-liberal organization, that liberalism is fundamentally incompatible with a great construction like EU. I don't know what to call it, because it's not a state, it's not an empire, it's not a federation. So EU and liberalism is a problem. And I think we see that problem emerging today in many ways. You mentioned Trump, which was you talked about a coalition of non-leftist groups ganging up against the left. I think you can read some of the populism in Europe today in exactly the same way, as non-leftist group ganging up against what they call not the left, but an elite. And here liberalism and elitism has a very interesting, connection, which has to be worked out. And I think we're still in the beginning of this working out. I would also like you to perhaps come back to it. In what way, in how is liberalism and democracy connected? Can we conceive of a liberal state which is not democratic? Or do those two things hang together? We know very well there are democracies which are not liberal. That's no problem. But can the opposite be true also? That we have a state which is very, very liberal, but not at all democratic. I would like you to come back to that. I think I might have used up my time, so I stopped there. But I'm afraid I'm asked more questions and gave answers. But I think that was perhaps my role, to, at least yet.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Let's keep those questions, and then we invite Karin to comment
Thank you.
and elaborate, and then we can have a discussion.
I think it's really good to start a conversation like this. I mean, for the past month or so, we've had a very vivid debate in Sweden about what liberalism is. I find that more people on the socialist side seem to be interested in that debate than on the right side. But to me, sort of trying to access liberalism through American texts was a very good way of understanding what it's like to be a liberal in Sweden. Because we always have these confusions of whether, Americans talk about liberals as being leftist, whereas we use liberals as something that denounces being to the right. But I still remember with the first time that I read Hayek, I always come back to this. The last pages of, he wrote an essay called Why I'm Not a Conservative. And to me, that was really a bit of an epiphany, because it made me very confused in the exact same way as Americans tend to be confused when they come here and we talk about liberalism. Because that was when I realized that my concept as a Swedish liberal was often quite a conservative concept, whereas a lot of Swedish conservatives took a much more liberal, an American point of view. And our socialists were often very reactionary. So it really put everything on its head. And I think it's a very good exercise to get to know about yourself and your ideological position from sort of an outside perspective. So thank you very much for that. Classical liberalism is a huge topic. I'm not sure that it's so much a tree as sort of a forest. And it's very difficult to say anything sort of concrete about it in 5 minutes. But if I were to sort of try and emphasize 3 points that I think are more important than other points today in particular, I would choose the following. First of all, I think it's important to start, if you want to explain classical liberalism, with explaining that it emanates from a very particular sort of view on mankind, that it's not just a way of looking at the state or the society, but it's something that comes from the way that we look at people as such. And I think the great thing about classical liberalism is that it's actually something that combines or sort of acknowledges that society belongs to people who are both individuals, but in a way also sort of tribal agents. It is not a theory that thinks that people should be isolated, that we're atoms who have no connection to each other. Quite the contrary. I think in many ways it's much more communal than that. And I think the beauty of classical liberalism is that it managed to combine the two. And this is important to point out there because there are so many straw men involved. When you're accused of being a neoliberal, which we tend to be, you're always sort of faced with two pictures of what that might be. And one is that neoliberals or classical liberals are 100% egotistical. They're all about my stuff, not being your stuff. That they're 100% rational. And everybody on the right mind understands that this is not the case. And the other bogeyman that we always meet is quite the opposite. And it's interesting that these 2 points coexist. And that is that classical liberals are naive because they think that people are 100% altruistic. They always want good. And if there's just no state there interfering, we would have an ideal society. That is not the case. I would say it's actually quite the opposite. Classical liberalism is anti-utopian. And I think that is something that stems, again, from the way we perceive people. Not as being perfect, not as being horrid, but most of the time being something of both. And I think it's very important to sort of start on that basis to explain why we look at the state the way we do. Because classical liberals, at least of my camp, we don't believe that politicians are worse than anybody else. We don't believe that bureaucrats are more sort of amoral than anyone else. It's just that we don't think that they're better than anybody else. And if you believe that people in general are flawed, you don't want to concentrate a whole lot of power into the hands of people who don't have all the information that you need, who don't always make rational judgments. And you just don't want people who are not semi-gods to have too much power over your life. And that is the basis. And I think that that's something that we need to come back to, especially now when there is a huge surge for for state coercion. And where this is something that people are actively looking for, we need to remind ourselves of this. That it's very strange that while we're constantly complaining of awful politicians who don't know anything and who's meddling with our lives, we're still asking for them to control us to a greater extent. And I think that's a strange paradox. I think the third issue that we need to remind ourselves of, and where classical liberals, I think, have a more holistic and better view than most other liberals, and that is on the aspect of rule of law. And that is also something that comes back to why we think that the state shouldn't govern our lives too much. Because right now we have a big discussion on the police, we have a big discussion on the defense, we have a big discussion on whether the monopoly of violence is actually there to protect us. And that's a good thing. The bad thing about this is that we forget that rule of law is not only about the state protecting good people from bad people, it's also there to protect good people from bad states, or from bad politicians, or from bad people trying to rule us through the state. And we've completely forgotten that last aspect. We want more authority, more public authority, but we've forgotten the discussion on the division of power and on why it's very important to keep people out of our private life to the greatest extent possible, I think. And that is also why I would urge all of you to buy a book. Now I'm doing a bit of a commercial here, which we published not too long ago, called The Liberalism of Fear by Judith Sklar, that I think gives a really good summary of why constitutional issues is something that we should look into more, both as an antidote towards authoritarian populism that is on the rise, but also because she really fights against the nosy, nudging socialist welfare state that I think that state individualism that we all love has created for us. So when you find yourself in despair over the discussion on liberalism that you find on DN, buy our books.
Thank you. That's why you are a liberal. Thank you. Yes, Ben, please.
Thank you. Very, very interesting lecture, Dan. I agree with you on many points, especially when you say that liberals might have gone too far in making it simple. And I think that I also agree with you, Carl, saying that your definition of liberalism might still be a little bit too narrow, i.e. a little bit too simple. I think that you might have fallen in your own trap there. I think that you ended your last slide here with stating that classical liberalism is not a philosophy of life. I think that it is, in some sense. And this is why. I agree with you, Karin, completely here. Liberalism emanates from a certain view on mankind, as you said. I think that's important to remember here. I'll get back to that. A few days ago, I picked up John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. I reread some parts of chapter 2, which includes perhaps the best defense of freedom of speech ever. It's great. John Stuart Mill writes that under freedom of speech, where ideas are free to be exchanged, ideas are also exchanged so that the better ideas survive, so to speak. When false ideas collide with truth, the intensity of truth grows, which is why freedom of speech is naturally working towards betterment in society. So I read these paragraphs in Mill, and I started thinking, is that really true today? In the digital age, I'm not sure that that's happening here. And I'm not saying that we should commit to state intervention or anything, nothing like that here. But there's no such impact between truth and falsity in the digital age, because with very limited means, one can gain a major impact on the political debate. And a lot of times, it's not the truth that wins, quite the opposite. So, some actors in the political sphere manage to create irrational narratives that govern how people think of politics. And it's therefore freedom of speech, the idea that freedom of speech or that a free exchange of ideas renders ideas better, that's only conditionally true. It's not necessarily true. What are those conditions then? Well, first, without a rational exchange of ideas, it's quite certain that a freedom of ideas does not really render a better society. So, what should we do about this then? Can classical liberalism answer to that question? As I said, we should not commit to state intervention here. But still, can we find guidance in social affairs such as political debate? Can we find guidance in classical liberalism there? Political debate is really something that consenting adults engage in. What does liberalism have to say then? Nothing? Well, that's how I interpreted you, that while there's between consenting adults engaging in political debate, there's nothing that classical liberalism can say. So it cannot help us in this dilemma. But since I have the view that classical liberalism is, in some sense, a philosophy of life, emanating from a certain view of mankind, I think that we can find guidance in classical liberalism, how to behave and develop behavioral norms in social affairs to establish a rational exchange of ideas without committing to state intervention. And that's what I think that private businesses should do, what news outlets should do, what academics should do. They should go to classical liberalism, go and see what do classical liberals say about human beings as a rational being capable of effective cooperation. What can we learn there in the sphere of social life? I think there's a lot to learn. Therefore, I think that liberalism is a philosophy of life, at least in some sense. I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and now if we ask all the panelists and Dan to come up, we have a number of interesting and difficult themes to discuss further. And it seems to be a common view among you who are commenting that liberalism is good, you like it, and that's good. But it seems like there is a quest for a broader perspective in some way, more humanitarian, more individualistic, more to understand how society of a free man is actually working. And they accuse you of being too economistic in some way. Are you an economic man?
I do have a PhD in economics. I do teach in an economics department, but I plead not guilty. So I don't think my talk implied that narrowness. I mean, most of my talk, as far as the Smith part, is on the theory of moral sentiments. And I'm sure you're familiar with that, and I don't know how you compare it to Montaigne, but it hardly comes across as Gary Becker or George Stigler. So I do think that these guys saw, I wanted to put this slide up, that commutative justice is just the lower things. It's not saying, hey, our view of life is confined to the lower things. It's saying we need to have a social grammar to function, especially as society gets more complex and global and so on. But what do we do with grammar? we build the beautiful things, the aesthetic things, which do not have precise and accurate rules, which have rules very different than those of grammar. So the emphasis on the importance of breaking out this concept and its specialness is not in any way to slight what you do with it in the larger things. I think that, you know, Smith and Hume's maybe a little less Montaignian than Smith, but I mean, I love Hume too. But I do think these guys are super broad and rich in all of these wonderful ways, and so I see part of my job is to entice people to read Hume and Smith that way, to go back to them. Another guy who fits in, I think, and kind of relates to some of the confusing terminology is Burke, who gets dubbed a conservative. He was a liberal. He was absolutely a liberal 1.0, but because he didn't like the French Revolution, because he wasn't sanguine about democracy, he got turned into a conservative, a very strange word, conservative. Anyhow, I plead not guilty to the narrowism charge. It's not just about, gee, what's important is that my stuff isn't messed with. That's just a starting point. And I don't see it as like narrowly about economics, really. I don't know, do we want to continue or what now?
Carl, what are your comments?
I would rather pick up what you said and be really liberal. I think you're both right about philosophy. I think that liberalism is a philosophy, but the thing with that philosophy, it provides no definitive final answers.
This is about philosophy of life
Yeah,
issue.
is that what we're talking about?
I disagree with you on that. I'm kind of struck by that you proclaim that, actually. To me, liberalism is telling people about their philosophy of life. Here's where not to look. Don't look for statism. Don't look for a highly governmentalized society. Don't look for politics as your philosophy of life. What it says after that, I don't think it says something very specific, and I don't know what it's supposed to say. You know, I think what's important in life is family, work, you know, being creative, being independent, and so on and so forth. Friends, Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments spoke of the love of those you live with as the cardinal matter of well-being. They're the people with the best knowledge of your conduct and your intentions. So, I don't know, does this make a philosophy of life? I don't think so. And I think we get, I think we've had too many people suggesting it's a philosophy of life, and that getting us into trouble, frankly.
You can't take that. No, you possibly can't take that.
That's great. I think that your narrow view of classical liberalism is not a philosophy of life. But I adhere to a broader view, or a thicker view. If we go back to Adam Smith, for instance, he said that when he studied behavioral theory, he said that we exchange products, we exchange goods, and both of us learn from it or gain from it. But he also said we exchange sympathy with one another. And we exchange something that is beyond tangible goods, which means that there's something to learn in classical liberalism that is not a matter of politics, but it's definitely some matter of social life. So therefore, there are things that we can learn from classical liberalism. Then why not learn?
I'm sympathetic. I mean, I think to maybe backpedal a little bit on what I just said, I do think that liberalism perhaps allows one to think about a metaphorical or allegorical sort of big cooperation, team humanity, and how my pursuing honest income, in fact, is serving other people's interests, cooperating with them only allegorically, because I never even see them, frankly. And in the sense that that is a background principle of one's life philosophy, I'm with you. But that doesn't really take you very far on a day-to-day basis and over the year after year after year, in my view. I mean, I think it's good if people embrace that and think of themselves as liberal on some such bases, but I don't think that's going to be a fulfilling principle, you know, a principle that makes life fulfilling of itself for normal people. I mean, maybe for us who are professional liberals, but we got to think about, you know, the ordinary liberals. Who are they? Right. They're not in this room, right?
Karin.
All right. We're the professors. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Karin.
I'm noting that this debate is much cozier than the one on the Enkultur, and then on the one on the Enkultur. And I think, I mean, I think part of the reason why most Swedes, probably in comparison to most Americans, especially as classical liberals, find it difficult to discuss values and ethics, dygder, virtues, is because we have a tendency to politicize those. So, and I think that is something that's getting us into trouble now, because there is this view of classical liberalism as again, amoral or relativist, or, you know, not taking a stance on ethical issues, which is not the case. But I would agree with you to the extent that it is a worldview which is ethical, and I say that because I think it influences how you behave towards other people. So if you're a Hayekian and you've grown accustomed to thinking that just because I don't understand something, maybe I'm not really entitled to ask for it to be, you know, forbidden. That it's tolerance, I think, is really at the core here. And tolerance is, I would say, one of the liberal virtues that makes it something more than just a political idea, but something that has a much broader impact on us as people. Yeah.
Now people are nodding. Tolerance seems to be... Is tolerance part of this classical liberalism?
Absolutely. I'd only say that you need more to build life, for build life projects. Being tolerant, being liberal, doesn't tell you what really you're going to invest yourself in my view.
Isn't this a strength of liberalism? It's a very thin ideology, which gives you a framework, and you can fill it with whatever you like. And I think that is a kind of philosophy, and it's a very good philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't know what to fill it with,
No,
and they
but,
feel empty, and that's one reason they turn to
it's,
cohesionist politics.
To what?
To cohesionist
It's
politics.
Yes.
So it is a big problem. I mean, it's scary. I mean, the modern era, and I mean the last 500 years, is scary. It's a big challenge to Paleolithic man, which is what I think we are. So I think of these guys like Smith as therapists, frankly, helping us cope with this strange modern world.
But where is liberalism going then? Is it?
I don't know. That's a very good question. I do feel that there was a really momentous change that happened at the end of the 19th century and going forward, and we live, as it were, ever since then in a sort of social democratic age. And we're like nestled within it. We're like caught within it, and we're talking within it. And whether or not that whole momentous change can actually be rethought, reconsidered in some meaningful way. I do think the left generally, dominates the cultural institutions. So we do what we can, we carry on, but I'm not sure what to expect.
But that's very interesting. It's the same thing in Sweden. They dominate the cultural institutions. But how come they do that? Why have we let them do it? Or do they have more persuasive arguments? Are their arguments possibly better? Do they sort of fulfill a need which we cannot fulfill? And I think that liberalism is a rather thin ideology. It's very hard to think liberalism go out to demonstrate on the liberal banners. While it's very easy to imagine the left go out because their slogans are so much easier to identify with.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we went out to demonstrate, it would mainly be big signs saying "Mind your own business," and that wouldn't.
I would join that
but
parade.
I don't think many people would follow us.
Yeah.
don't mess with other people's
Yeah.
stuff,
Or-
and mind your own business.
Or as I put it rather crudely at the beginning.
Yeah.
Karin, did you have another comment or?
No, perhaps just a last question to you as well, and I think this is really the million-dollar question, so I'm not expecting you to give me an answer to it, but something that I'm wrestling a lot with is, again, the theme of authoritarian populism, which is really, I think, state communitarianism. So it's the antithesis of what we believe in. And it is because they are telling us that the state is there and should coerce us into one single idea of what is meaningful, which is something that we can never abide to. And then our answer is that, well, mind your own business. And obviously that argument is not very persuasive these days. So what's the follow-up question?
I'm scared too, and I don't mean to suggest that the only illiberal movements out there are the left, so to speak. I mean, if I think the left have, unfortunately, kind of an illiberal element to them, and I know they're conscientious and will do better in the future. It's not to say that, they're the only that's the only problem. I think that these other things, which the left would say is, of course, not the left, are also threats to liberalism. So I agree. I mean, I'm worried too. I don't know, what's going to happen. I did want to comment on democracy before we open it up, but did you want to follow up on that, or?
I'm not sure we have time.
No.
Yeah.
Perhaps a last comment on democracy.
I think
This
that
little tiny question.
yeah. So, can you get that from this side? The relationship between democracy and liberals is extremely interesting. I do think democracy has been vastly oversold in a sense. You can have, the idea that if you told Hume and Smith that, of course, democracy and liberty go hand in hand, they would have thought you odd. And it wasn't the sensibility of them or of James Madison, for example. And also, this era of liberalism was not democracy. It was aristocracy. And the truth is, and I could show you quotes of people saying this, liberalism succeeded to the extent that it did because a small number of thinkers persuaded a small number of rulers that it was a good idea. It's not clear that liberalism can make ground in democracy, frankly. Democracy does not necessarily create responsible rule. You've probably all seen the Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility. Remember Uncle Ben saying that? And one of the nice things about aristocracy is that they had great power, and they felt more responsibility, both in the sense that they were more accountable for their rule, and in the sense that they acted more responsibly. And in democracy, no one has great power. And the governing set, or to use Schill's term, the central zone, is like dispersed and doesn't have that same investment and accountability and feeling of responsibility. So, democracy does not by any means, necessarily spell liberalism. And I do think you can, if you're lucky, like Hong Kong was for a long time, have liberalism without democracy.
Okay, thanks. And now I think it's time to open up for questions from the audience, and we have a mic. One gentleman in the back. Please state your name and the question. A short question, precise question.
Thank you. My name is Lana Losic. I'm a registered liberal, and I'm also assistant professor of European studies at Manipal University. So my question is if the classical liberalism, or liberalism in general, is a idea that's still very limited to the state, a state-centric idea, or if it could be applied more directly for other kinds of organizations and polities, let's say like the European Union or global governance. Thank you.
I think so, certainly. The EU does govern and pass rules. It's a jural superior. It messes with other people's stuff. So I think that the ideas certainly apply to it as well. It is primarily a matter, I see it as primarily a policy agenda, a policy tendency, that presumption of liberty. But it doesn't have to be just national governments that it pertains to.
Like to add anything? Okay. More questions? You, please.
Hello, my name is Katarina Karkainen. I have a question about what you said about liberalism not being based on axioms, because I'm not sure what you mean and I don't think I agree with you. Doesn't taking like the non-aggression principle and putting that against some kind of broader liberal principle open up for arbitrary answers to political questions? Isn't it rather so that liberalism has its axioms, but implementing them in social life, in society, it takes a thinking, compromising person?
There is a species of a kind of liberalism. You might think of it as libertarianism in the manner of Murray Rothbard, Rothbardian libertarianism. That is highly axiomatic. And I think it's quite flat and flawed, so I reject it. I do think that all sorts of exceptions, holes, gray areas are in liberalism 1.0, and that Hume and Smith were totally aware of that and allowed those and even discussed them to a great extent. And you're right, it does open up quite more question marks. You know, it's easier if you just stick by a rule like axiomatically, like 100% of the time. I mean, it seems intellectually easier. But it doesn't work for a number of reasons. It doesn't work because a lot of those answers, you know, there are exceptions, certainly. And it's also too impractical and extreme in many cases. And we need to have more moderate discourse and so on. That's part of politics too. That you should honor that. You shouldn't give me that look, June. I mean, I think there's a role both for that more challenging approach when it's on the right track, and the more bargaining approach. But I think there are all these exceptions and problems and internal tensions about getting more liberty or protecting liberty. Sometimes liberty has to be sacrificed to advance liberty, I believe. And Smith clearly believed.
Jesper, something for you perhaps to comment on?
Well, I couldn't agree more. The axiomatic view of ethics and political philosophy is just not a very good approach to political philosophy, in my view. There's the view that you have used here, that's fruitful. We're getting somewhere there. So, yeah, I said it well.
Okay. Anyone more? Oh, there is a question. And the mic, perhaps, to the front here.
May I give just a small piece of information?
Yeah, take the mic, please.
May I give just a small piece of information? I have here a book, a Swedish book in English, The History of Western Liberalism, recently produced by Uppsala University. And I would be most grateful if Professor Klein would accept this copy as a gift.
Okay.
Tremendous.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Who's the publisher on that? Uppsala?
Uppsala University.
Oh,
And
far
we had
out.
a question
Wonderful.
there as well.
My name is Måns Cederberg, and I have a question. You said giving up freedom to gain more freedom. Do you have an example for that?
National defense type examples, for like in Smith in The Wealth of Nations, he endorses the Navigation Acts, which restricted the amount of foreign ships and foreign crews could come and port in Britain. This would stimulate British ship production, the marine industry, which he said is vital to Britain's national defense, that they should be, strong on the seas. Doesn't sound crazy to me. Now, it's a restriction of liberty. like it's telling some folks, hey, no, you can't be a crew here, or you got to comply with these special restrictions, without question. But maybe he's right in that particular case, that it was good overall for liberty, because it's a good thing that Britain doesn't get conquered. Yeah.
Modern example.
A more modern, well, just first of all, national defense generally, you could make the similar case. In Sweden, perhaps it's you feel it a little bit more with Russia, not so far away. So that would be an example. I mean, taxes to me are encroachment on liberty, but maybe if they keep Putin out, it's net liberty, at least as far as the defense spending goes. I can't say. I'm just saying I'm perfectly open to the argument. Immigration's another big issue. I mean, if you believe that immigrants will violate liberty, or in a meaningful way move the culture, right, and the electorate against liberty, that's an argument. I think it's a respectable argument.
Okay, we have a number of difficult issues to handle in the future, apparently. Some last words, comments before we round off?
Well, it's been great.
Good. Next.
Great.
Great.
Well, I think it's been great, but I see great problems also for liberalism. There are sort of forces at work in today's Europe, especially. You mentioned the immigration crisis, but also I see EU as a great problem for the kind of liberalism you have discussed, and also because you say we need to fill our life with a sort of liberalism is very thin ideology, and if it's sort of put on a global scale, it becomes even thinner. It can't even work. I mean, just take a small example. We have national football teams. We have the local teams. We have Djurgården in Sweden, a national team. I start believing in EU when you see an EU football team competing internationally. We'll never see that. And I think this is you might find it a very silly example, but it says something that we need to belong, we're locally rooted, and liberalism emphasizes that. And the new forces, the centrifugal forces in Europe, tend to work against this. Therefore, I see that it might be a very important anti-liberal or even illiberal backlash.
Okay. Last words. Not so positive. There are many challenges. We have heard that now that classical liberalism could be seen as a branch or a trunk or the roots of liberalism. So we are learning more about the tree. It seems to be a very lively tree, and I think we should continue this discussion and debate. It's important, and I think we need more of it in Sweden. We need more people who are aware of these questions, and there will be difficult questions in the future to come. Please, let us give a big hand to Dan and the panelists. This has been great.